This section is devoted to Caribbean poets, two poets in particular, 20th century Caribbean poets. And the first one would be Derek Walcott. Walcott is interesting for many reasons, but one of them is he was trained as a painter. Before he became a poet, he was a trained painter. And he painted throughout his life, although he's much better known as a poet. In fact, he won the Nobel Prize. Still, he was a devoted painter. And he's a poet whose poems are obviously influenced by painting and whose paintings maybe have some poetic influence as well. One of his more interesting texts is a long autobiographical poem called Another Life, which is kind of poetic memoir, if you like, of his own youth and education. And he talks about his discovery of Italian Renaissance painting. Now, he was growing up in St. Lucia, which is one of the Caribbean islands, so he had no direct access to Europe or to Italy, so he couldn't go to Italian museums. But he learned a lot about the Italian Renaissance through books, through photographs and reproductions in a book. And he really was inspired by this material, which he recalls in his poem Another Life. Our father, who floated in the vaults of Michelangelo, Saint Raphael of Siena, and gold leaf. It was then that he fell in love, having no care for truth, that he could enter the doorway of a triptych, that he believed those three stiff horsemen cantering past a rock toward the jeweled cities on a cracked horizon, that the lances of Uccello shivered him like Saul, unhorsed, that he fell in love with art and life began. So it's a rather eloquent tribute to the inspiring power of Italian Renaissance painting. But there's an element of irony here because he's praying to Raphael as though Raphael were a god or a saint. Whereas, ironically, Michelangelo and Raphael devoted much of their painting to glorifying the Catholic Church and the saints and of the Catholic Church and Jesus and Mary and the Christian God. Here in Walcott's poem, it's the painters themselves who are, in effect, deified and worshipped by the young Caribbean would-be painter. So he fell in love with these paintings, and he just was completely immersed in them. And it had a kind of religious or spiritual impact on him. So the lances of Uccello stabbed him and really violently disturbed him in a inspiring way, like Saul, who famously on the road to Tarsus was, he saw God and he was knocked off his horse, and then he became Paul and he was converted to Christianity and became one of the great propagandists of the Christian religion. So Walcott imagines himself going through this kind of conversion process, but instead of conversion to religion, it is a conversion to European aesthetics or European art. And he says, I had no care for truth. So for him, it's a purely artistic or aesthetic matter. He's not interested in the truth at this point. He's just interested in the aesthetic, artistic power of these Italian painters. If you're wondering what the lances of Uccello refer to, well, here is one of the three images, maybe that's the triptych, the three images that Walcott is thinking about, but this is the one of the images from Uccello's painting, The Battle of San Romano, and it's quite stunning, frankly, the use of the lances, which I think, when we think of Italian Renaissance, we often think of basically a kind of pictorial realism, a invention of three-dimensional perspective. But here we got a kind of, I would consider it a kind of proto-abstract painting, which the lances add this wonderful geometrical abstraction to the representation of a battle. But Walcott imagines himself almost stabbed by one of these lances from the painting. So as Painter gave us a very imaginative reconstruction of Mona Lisa, so Walcott, in thinking about Uccello, gives us another imaginative adaptation. So these poets are adapting the paintings almost the way someone like Chaucer or Wyatt would be adapting the Italian poems. Now, a very different Caribbean poet is Kamau Brathwaite. Now, if you ever studied Caribbean poetry of the 20th century, it's fascinating. One of the things that makes it fascinating is you have these two great poets, Brathwaite and Walcott, who are almost exact opposites in most ways. They're so different in almost any way. So there's this wonderful dialectical tension between the two of them, and they both lived a long time, and they wrote for decades, and they had critical remarks about each other. So here's a poem by Brathwaite. Now, Walcott, one reason he probably won the Nobel Prize is because he's very Eurocentric. And you can see it already in Another Life, in that scene of his imagining of the Italian Renaissance paintings. Although there's irony involved, still there's a kind of adoration of European culture. Whereas Kamau Brathwaite was very scholarly. He definitely knew European culture very well, but he was much more personally attached to African culture. Okay. So in Caribbean culture, you have, to simplify things, to simplify too much, but nonetheless, there's this tension between the European legacy of colonialism and then the African past of the modern day Caribbeans, most of whom are descendants of African slaves. So Brathwaite has a poem called Aachen. I'm just giving you a few excerpts from the poem, but it gives us a much more critical perspective on the Italian Renaissance. And in a part of the poem I'm not quoting, Brathwaite actually criticizes Walcott for his idealizing of clarity. So Walcott idealizes a clarity, like the clarity that typifies Renaissance painting, or at least the famous Renaissance painters were likely to think of, someone like Raphael. Whereas Brathwaite is much more committed to a poetics of obscurity or ambiguity. And indeed, Walcott usually writes in standard English, whereas Brathwaite often writes in Caribbean dialects, which are often extremely hard to read, but maybe closer to the oral culture of the Caribbean and the speech of normal people in the Caribbean. So here's a bit of his poem, Aachen. Masons will rape this virgin of her words, of her drapery of satin, until she is Satan again. Botticelli will have wet dreams about her, even unto the topaz eyelips of her navel. Da Vinci will make her wink, and the Portuguese will put her face up for sale. Mercantilism, not the black Magnificenti dei Medici, will appear in the papers of the past tomorrow. So we saw Walcott ignoring the truth and just focusing on the beauty of the Italian Renaissance. Brathwaite is much more concerned with the truth, and the truth might be the history of the early modern Europe and its relationship with Africa, right? Frederick Jameson famously said, history is what hurts. And Brathwaite gives us a sense of this, the rape of the Virgin. The Virgin is unclear who she is, but she might be a kind of allegorical figure for Africa itself or African slaves. Keep in mind that most of Italian Renaissance literature is propaganda, either for the Catholic Church or various patrons like the Medici, famous banking family of Florence. And so Italian painting, Italian literature are entwined with the often unsavory politics of that era, okay, including the history of colonization and the international slave trade. The Portuguese were, I think, the first European country to get involved in this. And the Portuguese were Catholics, so they were part of the papal Catholic culture. Obviously, it wasn't just Catholics because the English would later on get involved in the slave trade. But the economic exploitation of the slave trade and mercantilism, or early capitalism in general, was characteristic of this period. And Braithwaite gives us a much more sour or satirical view of this culture, which Walcott is more inclined to idealize. Now, you might be wondering, what does he mean, the Black Magnificenti dei Medici? Well, actually, here is a portrait, not a famous portrait, at least for aesthetic reasons, but it's historically important because the child here is actually the child of a Medici duke. I think he was Duke Alessandro, who the Medici, as I said, was the ruling family of the city of Firenze. They're very important in the history of Florence and European culture in general. But apparently, Duke Alessandro was the illegitimate child of a Medici cardinal and an African slave woman. So this is his daughter, and apparently this is the first image of a child of African descent in a European painting. So it's historically significant for that reason. So maybe Braithwaite is thinking about some of the Medici family members who might have actually had African descent or partly African descent. But the idea seems to be that African element is oppressed, and as the centuries go on, this is a kind of purged by European culture.